Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this Perspectium webinar, Improving Customer Transparency and Responsiveness with Automation. Just trips off the tongue. I am very glad to be joined today by Kerry Blunt, who is the Chief Architect for Service Management Tools at Fujitsu in the UK. Fujitsu is a great customer for Perspectium. We are doing some really good things together, so I'm glad that Kerry's been willing to come on live and tell us his story. And it really is going to be the Kerry show. But Kerry, before we get started, I know you're going to give a great introduction to Fujitsu. Why don't you introduce yourself and your role and what it is you do for Fujitsu?
Yeah, sure. So I've worked for Fujitsu for a long time now, over 20 years, and I am responsible. I work for the bit of Fujitsu that's responsible for our global delivery. So the bit of the organization that tries to introduce global standards and enable Fujitsu to work globally across the world. And my particular focus around that is with service management tools, and I have some responsibility for both our field service management tools and our service desk service management tools.
Perfect. So before we get started, before I let Kerry loose, some administrative stuff. This session is being recorded, so if you don't want to say anything bad, don't say it out loud. But really, if you have any questions to ask, please ask your questions at any time during the session, using the questions tab, which is on the right-hand side of your control panel. I'd ask if you use questions rather than chat, because if there are any questions that we can't get to because of time during the session, we'll be able to answer them after the fact. The chat content disappears as soon as we end the call. So please post your questions through the question tab. And with that, Kerry, take it away. And I'm going to throw questions at you throughout the session as well. So.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much. So hi everyone. This is session. You're gonna love the slides for this session. So we're going to start with some really nicely presented, beautiful slides that are the marketing slides. So these are the slides the marketing department gives me and says I contractually need to present first before I tell you anything you really want to know. But it does give you some background on who Fujitsu are. So you can read a whole lot of this stuff yourself, but Fujitsu is the 7th largest IT service provider in the world and the #1 in Japan. And all of Fujitsu's business is really concentrating around a theme of trying to do good for society. So we're obviously an IT company. We sell products and we sell services, and more we're involved with digital transformation, but also with a general idea that we want to improve society. So every time that we try and give you some idea of the outcome you might get from working with Fujitsu, we try to give some idea of the outcome we might give for society together when we work together with the customer. So you'll see things in here about how much we are helping with contactless payment, or how much we're talking about the moving of water or power or wind energy. Fujitsu is involved in a whole lot of industries and almost everything you can think of. And Fujitsu is quite a long-standing player. We've got over 80 years. We've been in the IT game. We developed our first computer in Japan in 1954. So really, Fujitsu is one of the original pioneers of computing around the world. And you'll notice that as we go through this slide set, we move away from the nice marketing slides, the pretty slides, and the slides get uglier and uglier as we go through, and we get to the slides that I created, which are significantly less impressive to the one we've got in front of you at the moment.
Oh, those marketing people.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And I just want to sort of bring up here an overview of sort of the size of Fujitsu. And I think this is really important, because as we talk about later in this presentation around how we need to integrate and connect bits of the Fujitsu world and customers across the world together, you need to kind of understand the size of the of the challenge. We have, there's 205 different individual Fujitsu companies just within Japan, and 100,000 people working for Fujitsu in Japan. So, straight away, that's a pretty large company, and that's just Japan. And then if you start to look across the rest of the world, there are an awful lot of Fujitsu entities, an awful lot of Fujitsu locations, and an awful lot of Fujitsu people that need to be involved in delivering a service for a customer, or could be involved with delivering a service for a customer, no matter where they are in the globe.
Does every region do everything, or does one region provide center of excellence services to other parts of Fujitsu?
In general, every region does everything, but might rely on another region for a little bit of support in some cases, depending on the maturity. Okay. So the hardware, for example, is produced predominantly in Japan and in Europe. The Fujitsu hardware, if you've got a Fujitsu branded laptop, then those are the locations. But in terms of delivering services, we try and deliver those services from pretty much all of the locations.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so that's a bit about Fujitsu, and so let's get on to talk a little bit about the particular challenge that Fujitsu had, and how we used Perspective to overcome that challenge. So as part of our delivery of service, we have a number of large ServiceNow IT service management platforms, which we use for managed service provider work. So if we're delivering a service desk for a customer, then we do that via one of these large ServiceNow ITSM platforms. And they're all over the world. And in fact, we've got one that covers predominantly the Americas, one that covers Asia, one that covers Europe, and one that covers what we call our Oceania region, so Australia and New Zealand. And then we've got a separate system for technical maintenance services, which is our field services operation. And then we've got an additional platform that's used for our own internal IT. So if something goes wrong with my IT, then obviously I need to talk to the internal IT group. And each one of those is a large ServiceNow platform with a lot of capabilities and a lot of customers on it. So for example, this Excalibur platform in the middle here has over 400 different customers on that platform where we're providing services for those customers. And if we were going to integrate those platforms together, already that's quite a large job. If we want to pass a ticket from a service desk which has been logged in Europe to, let's say, a shared Unix support team that's in Asia, then we might want to connect those two platforms together. And that's how big managed service providers like Fujitsu is able to provide a managed service, because we can provide a function like Unix support from a low-cost location, but access it from wherever you are in the world, wherever the customer first line desk happens to be. So if we were just to connect all of those systems together, that would already be quite a big problem. But actually, it's more complicated than that, because we also have some in-country ServiceNow platforms where we are delivering some service specifically in those countries. These platforms existed before we came up with this strategy of using these large regional platforms, and we've not yet migrated all the customers into that. So we've still got those platforms sat there. But also, it's not as easy as that still, because then a lot of our customers have their own ServiceNow platforms, and they might have the first line desks on their platform, but then pass the tickets into Fujitsu to one of these shared service platforms in order to access one of our shared services, like I mentioned, Wintel support or networks or whatever. And so if we were to integrate all of those point to point, and that was effectively our previous strategy, then that starts to get really complex really quickly. And what we realized was that different bits of Fujitsu were integrating these things differently. Sometimes there was some middleware involved. Sometimes they were point-to-point connections. They were generally all built bespoke. Sometimes there was some sharing of IP in order to sort of reuse one integration many times, but in often cases, they were all built bespoke from scratch. And that meant is if we're collecting an integration, let's say between the Excalibur instance at the top there and the customer A's ServiceNow platform in green at the bottom, then it would normally take us sort of at least 6 weeks to get a kind of a basic incident integration up and running, because you needed to get the resource who understood the customer's ServiceNow system, you needed the resource that understood Excalibur, you possibly needed a middleware guy in the middle, you had to get hold of them all, you need to get them in a meeting, they had to then have a big discussion about which fields you were going to map between different fields in each system. There was a big discussion about how you were going to handle errors, and it took a long time, and it cost really more than we really wanted to pay. And we felt that we were repeating that same thing over and over again in a fairly fairly unstructured, chaotic way.
Did you ever know how many people you had working on that at any given time when it was still in the?
Well, whole teams of, yeah, we had kind of whole teams of people, really, whole development teams who were just sort of integration specialists. At any one time, I think we would have had at least 15 to 20 people just working on integrations, probably within just a single region, just for the EMEA region, and then we probably had, depending on the size of the region, maybe another 4 or 5. Let's say 4 in Oceania, and then another 2 or 3 in Americas. And so, and none of those talk to each other. The people didn't talk to each other. They didn't share best practice. They were all separate bespoke teams.
Right.
And so a more sensible solution is to sort of implement a single message bus architecture in the middle with commonality, and effectively turn all these integrations into a cookie cutter approach to deliver something that's lower cost, but more importantly, quicker. For us, the real value here is that there was previously a big gap between the customer's perception of how long these things should take and how long they actually took. Big gap. And that was just bad for us because it didn't reflect well on our capability as an IT company. And it wasn't the IT that was always getting in the way. It was a lot of the other kind of political and time challenges, calendar, diary entry sort of stuff, that meant that these things just didn't happen as quickly and as easily as you thought it was going to be. Plus all of the additional testing that had to take place, and all that kind of stuff. It just adds up. We also had a specific challenge we had around reporting. So we wanted to produce really good reporting out of ServiceNow, and of course you can get good reports out of ServiceNow directly, but unless you turn on performance analytics, you don't get the historical and trend data. And we wanted to, and also you can't easily combine it with other sources of data to produce good quality management information. So we knew we wanted to get the data out into a separate data warehouse with its own reporting solution. And we didn't have a mechanism to do that we felt didn't create a huge sort of performance impact onto the ServiceNow platform. And didn't necessarily provide the right security features that we needed. So they were our 2 challenges. And obviously, actually, as you know,
Harry, that last one, were you moving data out of ServiceNow into the data warehouse, or you weren't doing that?
We weren't doing it at all because we couldn't find a way that we started moving it for some customers, just using sort of ODBC and other sort of basic mechanisms like that, extracts and things like that. But we soon realized that wasn't suitable to do at scale. You know, if you've
Okay.
got 400 customers on that platform, you know, the amount of change on that platform per day just means the amount of time it would take to batch export it all overnight. You know, there's just not enough time. Plus, we're delivering 24/7 services, so there isn't really a a batch window that you can use to extract the data out.
Got it. Thanks.
So, and as you're all on this webinar, you know that we chose Perspectium to do that, to solve those problems. And I think it's interesting to know why. First of all, because we had a challenge that was related to ServiceNow specifically, and I know Perspectium does a lot of other technologies, but we were attracted by the credentials of Perspectium in terms of their relationship with ServiceNow. Obviously, David Liu and his previous involvement with ServiceNow. And when we looked at the Perspectium product, you can feel the same, I say, quality of engineering behind the product as that you feel that you get when you're working within ServiceNow. So that kind of quality of engineering and sort of belief in the technology was very evident when we started to look at the capability. And it was also clear that Perspectium understood not just generic needing to integrate, but the idea of integration as a service, and specifically integrating around service management processes. So, you know, you can find an enterprise service bus vendor who says, oh yeah, we can integrate anything to anything, and it's super easy. You just need to know about both ends. And the point here is that Perspectium said, oh, if you're integrating ServiceNow to ServiceNow, then we've got the technology, but we already understand both ends, so that you don't have to tell us about that part. We know it already. And therefore, it was possible to demonstrate the time to value. We could see that it was going to be quick to build an integration, and that we could replicate that quickly and easily, so that we could roll out fast. We appreciated that this was effectively a very startup organization type approach. There weren't a lot of sort of heavyweight processes that we needed to go through when we were dealing with Perspectium. And we could see that when we started using Perspectium, there was heavy focus on the US. We could see that there was a growing European vision, and that ServiceNow were actively investing in European resources and European support capabilities, so that we knew we could get support for the product, not just within the US time zone, but in the European time zones, and in Asia if we needed it.
Yeah. Just for those who may not know, David Liu is Perspectium CEO and founder. He was also the founding developer and employee #1 at ServiceNow. So he's had a hand in both sets of products.
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that.
That's okay. And if there are any other questions, just throw them in through the question session. I'm scanning the ones coming in.
Okay, great. So that was about Perspectium, the company, but what about the technology? So we could see that we could build an integration in hours rather than the weeks it was taking us. And I remember quite early on in our Perspectium journey being on a phone call with a developer, two developers, one at either end, one a ServiceNow expert at one end and a ServiceNow expert at the other end, building something using Perspectium. And they built an integration, basic incident integration between the two platforms on a conference call within 2 hours. And I sat on that conference call and sort of watched it happen. And 2 hours later, with a bit of conversation on a call, we had a working incident integration. And of course, there's other stuff to follow about that. We want to add other processes and we want to test it. And, I'm not saying to you that you're going to be able to do everything within 2 hours, but the point we could see was that, this was a thing that you could do in hours and days rather than weeks and months, which is how long it was taking us before. And we could also see that all of the bits that are the typically tricky bits of an integration, the bits that you don't always consider when you think, oh yeah, we'll just write our own, had already been built into the solution. So typically the security features, encryption, those kinds of things, no one thinks about those until a bit late, and then we try and retrofit them in later, and that becomes difficult. No one thinks necessarily about the technology to deal with a failure. What happens if one end of the integration is not available? Can we store that the request and then forward it when that integration becomes available later on, when the other end becomes available? So things like the store and the forward and the security technology were built in, and we could just make use of them, and there was no additional kind of thinking that was required in order to handle that. And one of the things that one of the killer features for us was the user experience of just ticket handling. So for those of you who've built an integration before, what generally happens is, because the two ends are different, you get things like the user's name, the configuration item, the incident description, and things like that. And you stuff them into a single text field and just send that text field over between the two systems. So if you're a desk agent, you've got the tickets that were opened natively in ServiceNow in front of you, and you've got the tickets that came in over an integration in front of you, and they look and behave differently. The ones that were open natively have all of the data in the right fields, and then the ones that came over the integration have got all the data stuffed in the description box. And so you have to, the agent has to spend a little bit more time digging the information out, and it's just not in the right place. When we use the Perspective integration, things like the CI and the user details come across with the ticket and all appear in the right fields on screen. So a ticket that gets opened up that's come across an integration looks and behaves exactly the same as a ticket that has been opened up natively on the platform. And that kind of user experience and efficiency you get from managing those tickets in all the same way we felt was a really useful feature. It's very difficult to quantify the amount of time you're saving, and therefore put a dollar value against it, but you are absolutely improving the quality of your desk agents' lives and saving time with your ticket handling. And so that was a very attractive idea for us.
A quick question on this one, Kerry.
Yep.
You mentioned, the time it took from, it used to take weeks, it now takes hours. What does that mean? I mean, what do you do with that extra time in the developer's day? I mean, are they working on different integration developments, or are they doing other types of development for you?
Yeah, they're just focusing on other more productive things, really. We need less developers that are working on integrations, but we can have them focusing on the real difficult integrations that still need to be bespoke, and not focusing on the basic incident ticket handling ones. So it just means we're getting more out of those developers for the same amount of time.
Right. Thank
you. Okay. And in terms of those developers, one of the things I say to people is that we're following a bicycle, not a tricycle approach. So again, for those of you who've kind of built an integration yourself before in the past, you need the guy who's the expert at one end, you need the guy who's the expert at the system at the other end, and quite often you need a middleware developer in the middle. So you've got 3 people, and those 3 people, you have to get them together, they have to have that discussion, they've got to work together nicely, and quite often it doesn't work nicely, and they're in silos, and they're in an argument about who does which bits of work. And what because you've got 3 people, you're effectively a tricycle, right? You're riding a tricycle. There's a reason that we ride around on bicycles and not tricycles. A bicycle is 2 wheels and is more efficient, it's faster, it's just as stable, it's just a better mode of transport. When you are using Perspectium, you don't need the middleware guy in the middle. You just need your ServiceNow guy that you've already got at one end, and the ServiceNow guy you've already got at the other end, who's doing all your other ServiceNow work, and they've just got a bit of integration work that they can do themselves. You don't have to have integration specialists, and you don't have to have the middleware guy. And it's just much faster and more efficient. And that kind of bicycle-tricycle analogy is sort of the best way I can find to sort of describe that. It's fairly obvious that having 2 people do the work who are people you know and trust already is better than having 3 people do the work. Not just from cost, but just from the point of view of just speed and ease of getting it to work. And so what have we actually managed to do? So it's all very good me sort of talking this game, but how many of these have we actually done? So we've currently got 22 different endpoints in our integration architecture. So that's 22 either ServiceNow instances or databases or other tools such as Jira, that we have the ability to talk any of those to any of the others. Of course, they don't all talk to each other, but if we wanted to, we could do, and all the ones that need to talk to each other do talk to each other. So that includes the 2 data warehouse integrations and one where we're using an integration with Jira. So a typical scenario there is maybe a defect in Jira is addressed through an incident in ServiceNow might end up becoming a problem, and that problem might end up becoming a defect in Jira for the developers to work on. And then as those developers fix that defect, that might cause then a change to get created in ServiceNow for the delivery of that updated bit of software back out to the estate. So that kind of thing we're doing in Jira. And overall, we've got at least 15 million records being exchanged over the Perspectium bus, typically in a month. And sometimes it's a bit more than that, but it's always at least that kind of volume. So if we think about each one of those updates, that's an update to a record. So that could be a new incident being moved to a different system. It could be an update to that incident. It could be CMDB data. It could be data going out to the data warehouse. So we've got that offline copy. But we've got a significant volume of traffic going over, which is effectively completely seamless to us. We don't have to count it. It makes no difference to us. We're not looking after the infrastructure. We don't have to have specialist people to manage any of that stuff. We just worry about the endpoints and which data we want to send where, and it just happens transparently for us in the background. And we plan to do more. So we plan, there's always more ITSM tools to integrate in, either ServiceNow or other flavors. BMC, Cherwell, some of those come up occasionally for us, and we know we've got a mechanism that we can just deploy to do that. So it means that costing those integrations and having faith in our ability to deliver those integrations is high. Cost is low, faith is high. And we do see there's a specific the Jira integrations have really kind of opened up the kind of DevOps thinking for us. And so we can definitely see a future for more and more of those Jira integrations where we've got that combination of the development and operational teams working together using a tool set. I mean, part of me says, well, we'll just stop people using Jira and make them use ServiceNow development SDLC. But I don't know if you've ever tried to get a developer to stop using Jira. It's almost impossible. So rather than fight that fight, we are just we're just integrating them in because it's quicker and easier to do so. Basically, we don't have to have the argument and try and move them. We can just integrate them in easily.
A great question. With you being based in the UK, great question just came in. How do you handle GDPR issues with user data? Yeah,
so this is kind of a beautiful thing with Perspectium actually, because the data is encrypted before it leaves the ServiceNow instance with an encryption key that only we know. Perspectium don't have that key. So the data is encrypted before it leaves the ServiceNow instance. It's then encrypted over HTTPS while it's in transit. And then it doesn't get stored by Perspectium. It's transient in the Perspectium system. And even however transient that is, it's already encrypted. And it doesn't get decrypted until it reaches the other end, when it reaches the endpoint. So when I was trying to get the security sign-off for Perspectium, it was and the GDPR sign-off for Perspectium, it was really easy because there's no point where Perspectium can go into the server and see any user data. They can only ever see the encrypted version of the data where I've got the key. So actually the sign-off for GDPR was really, really easy. Of course, you've still got to get the GDPR sign-off for the fact that you're moving ticket data between territories. But generally, GDPR allows you to move the data outside of the geographical boundary if you've got a good reason to do so. And for us, if we're delivering a service to a customer, let's say we're going on site to that customer to fix their laptop, we can't physically go on site unless we've got their name and their address. And so that data is required to deliver the service. And so GDPR is relatively easy to pass when it's data that's only required for the service and only being used to deliver the service.
Perfect.
I hope that answered the question.
I hope it answered well. It's a great answer. Thank you. So a question on the other ITSM tools. On the slide earlier, all of your customer examples had ServiceNow. Are you only supporting ServiceNow customers today? And do you see the ability to support other ITSM tools as a way of expanding your customer base, or is this for internal support?
So sort of if you went back sort of 10 years ago, there was a lot of CA stuff, there was a lot of remedy, there was a lot of variation in tools, and over the time we have just seen ServiceNow take all of that market. So the number of times we get requested to do something other than ServiceNow is pretty minimal, to be fair. We still do the occasional integration with a non-ServiceNow system, and you're right that they're all ServiceNow on that slide, but that's actually just because that's where our business is at the moment. Occasionally I will ring up Perspectium and ask for a quote for help with something that we don't see very often, like a Cherwell or a BMC remedy. And we haven't done any of those with Perspectium yet. We've quoted for a couple of times and not won the work, but we can see that it is going to be much easier to do than it would be if we were developing from scratch, because Perspectium provides a common document format, and the common document format, what the Perspectium integration does at each endpoint is turn the data into that common format and then send it to the Perspectium message bus. So you've got that commonality of data flow. And so we don't necessarily need to be an expert in Remedy or an expert in Sherwell. We can just put the Perspectium agent on and configure it, and a lot of the rest is taken care for us.
Cool.
I hope that answered the question.
Yeah.
Did I miss any bits of that, Andrew? No.
Yep. No, that got everything. So I think you have something on the call today. We have a mix of folks who are, like you, they work within the service provider community, but also the end customers themselves. You have an advantage of hindsight. What are your top tips that you would give to people? Either, if you're on the service provider side, what are the things to look out for, to be aware of before you embark on this kind of journey? Or from the customers, especially for your own new customers, what are the things you advise your customers, saying, here's what you need to be planning for in order to work more effectively with us as a service provider?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it's worth me saying that the idea for us to use Perspectium came from one of our customers. Our customers came to us, and one of our customers came to us and said, by the way, we're going to be using Perspectium for all of our managed service provider engagements, and so you need to get on board with that and deliver your end as a Perspectium endpoint. And we had not heard of Perspectium at that point, and so we looked into it, and immediately made a lot of sense. And we kind of felt a little bit foolish for being behind the curve in still building bespoke integrations. But because when you're a big managed service provider and you've got an army of people who can code stuff if you want to, then that kind of becomes your way of delivering until you realize that it's too costly and expensive to do so. So we quickly switched to sort of make Perspectium our standard for ServiceNow integrations straight away. And I think my advice to customers is to really consider your integration strategy as a proper strategy. So start from your point as the single point of the truth. If you're a customer that's owning your own ServiceNow instance, for example, and you want to connect it to a bunch of managed service providers, maybe Fujitsu's doing your networks, maybe BT is doing your telecoms, maybe IBM are doing your desktops, then your instance is the single instance of the truth, and you need to understand what your integration strategy is, and then you can you should ask those managed service providers how they're going to work with your integration strategy. If you can suggest a tool like Perspectium, which takes the effort out of it for you, then that just makes things so much easier. But either way, you should have considered your strategy and how things are going to be exchanged, because it's one of those things where we go, we'll just integrate between the two. But you really need to understand, for your smaller suppliers, are they going to come on board your platform? And for your larger suppliers, how are they going to integrate with you to take the data and deliver the service efficiently? And I would consider it more than just the sort of basic ticket data. You need to understand, how is the CMDB data going to flow? If Fujitsu is managing your server estate for you, then how are Fujitsu going to provide the server data into your CMDB? And how are you going to then pass that same data to IBM if they also need to know that for some other purpose? So you really need to consider that kind of architecture up front, I think.
Excellent, thank you. Hopefully that's useful tips for everyone. So
I think one more actually, while I think about it.
Sure.
I would also specifically think about change management. So when you're building an integration, everyone starts with the incident integration, and that's relatively easy. And then they do the problem one, which is pretty similar to the incident one. And then they get to the change one, and they find that the process variation is different. You're still all following ITIL, you're still all ISO 20000 compliant, but there's actually quite a bit of difference between the way the process might work at one end and the other end. And also, there is a lot of difference in the way you can implement it within the tool as well. So do you just have one change record, or do you have a change record with subtasks? Are all of your subtasks going to get passed across the integration, or just the ones that are important? There are the whole bunch of things that could be different. And so investing time in your understanding the differences in the change, the way the change process is actioned, and how that integration is going to work is time well spent, and will help you get that kind of change management much more efficiently. You know, how are you going to have service catalog replicated between two instances, or are you not going to bother? How are you going to get service requests from those catalogs passed between the two? Again, that's a type of change. So definitely focus your effort on that rather than just the incident and problem stuff, if you can.
Excellent. That was a good addition. Thank you. So I don't see any more questions coming in through the question panel. I think I have no more, believe it or not. So Kerry, it allows me to draw to a conclusion. If you can ping to the last slide, I really want to thank you for spending this time with us today. It's so good to hear someone who is such a strong advocate for Perspectivum tell the story directly. So I hope everyone who's joined has got value. We do have another session which is coming up. Registration should be going live next week, but towards the end of June, we will be hosting another of these webinars with our friends at PayPal, talking about how PayPal uses Perspectivum in their environment and how they focus all of their efforts on enabling a global economy and use service and data to support that. So watch out for registration. So they should be coming live early to mid next week. Kerry, again, thank you for the time you spent today. We always enjoy hearing your story. We look forward to that doing more section coming forward. And thank you all as the audience for being with us today. We'll see you next time.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.